Um, what happens the day after the Bar Kochva rebellion and the aftermath of all that, which is collapsed in blood. And we don't know enough about it. I got tired of saying that from the last, lecture I gave, but it's the truth. And sometimes the truth is frustrating. It's the truth. We know what we know, and that's assuming that all the sources we have are kind of accurate. There's no way of telling. It's 2,000 years. There's no YouTube. Now, this much we can put together. During the last years of the life of the Emperor Hadrian, and the rebellion ends in 135, he dies in 138. So another 3 years on the throne. Hadrian, all of the biographers tell us, was unpopular and he was ill. Okay, he didn't have a last happy 3 years. Good for him. Now, it seems, look, you're talking about descriptions written long, long ago. It seems the way to describe it, I think he had some kind of a cancer. And the reason I say it is because the ancient chroniclers tell us that many times he tried to kill himself and put himself out of misery, and his friends stopped him. And that sounds like some kind of very painful sort of illness, right? So I don't know, maybe it was some kind of migraine. We don't know, but it was something really bad. Couldn't happen to a nicer guy. But the fact is that he went through a lot of pain in the last years. And perhaps this affected it, perhaps it didn't, but we're told, once again, that in the last years he became very tyrannical. He wasn't the sort of normal guy, as you define normal, that he'd been beforehand, where he was very rational, running around the empire, trying to fix things up all the time, and so forth. And in the last couple of years, especially the last year of his life, he starts doing a Caligula, a Nero, and he starts ordering the deaths of many around him, including many senators. And so by the time he dies in 138, there's applause, which was stopped in the middle by his designated successor, Antoninus, who for that reason is called Antoninus the Pious, right? Antoninus Pius, all right? And the reason Antoninus Pius, because of course he tells the Senate, do not speak ill of the dead, de mortuis non nisi bonum, right? You all learned that in high school if you're a certain age. And this became the policy of his successor. Now, it seems, you're getting my, I won't say intuition, but my hunch based on putting a lot of things together many years. I think that Hadrian, at the end of his life, one of the things that bothered him was he was criticized a lot. And he couldn't take it. It's very hard for a dictator, because every Roman emperor is a dictator, to take criticism, except a little bit. They can say, you did a little here wrong, a little there. Everybody can handle that. Or let's put it this way, if you're not a Nero, you can handle that. Fix your tie, But maybe you're a little too hasty appointing this guy to be a governor in some place. But when they start criticizing you on big policies, that's considered very tough. And I don't think he could take it. And I think that one of the things he probably began to be criticized about, thank you, was his un-Roman policy, un-Roman Jewish policy of going after Judaism, which I told you really was sort of like against the rules of long-standing, wise, experience-gained imperial Roman policy. Here's the Roman Empire in the time of Hadrian. There's Dacia, Romania, which, Trajan had conquered. It's a big area. How does one rule this whole area? It ain't easy. By that I mean it's all kinds of different peoples. No, listen to what I'm about to tell you. There's all kinds of different people. Here the Greeks, here the Gauls, here the Spaniards, all so forth. How do you run that? You've got to have some kind of a chachma to it. You can't completely dominate and crush everybody all the time because it costs too much money. You can't afford it. You'll bankrupt the state. You follow? It's got to be, from pure selfish reasons, some way you make it that the army only has to be over here, protecting against the invaders, right? But the army doesn't have to be here all the time, stopping revolutions, revolts by desperate people. Now, if you follow a harsh policy, okay, you can provoke revolts at the drop of a hat. It's the easiest thing in the world. You understand? Go to the Jews and put up a pagan temple in Jerusalem. Go to the Greeks and, spit on Zeus. You see? Go to the Parthians and do whatever. You get what I'm saying? Like today we would say like this. Go tear up a Quran in the middle of Istanbul. There's ways of doing it. But it costs a lot of money. And even if you're successful in putting it down, was it a wise use of policies? If you were the CEO of the Roman Empire, and remember, this lasted for many centuries. If you're the CEO of an empire, you've got to develop policies over the course of time through conservative wisdom that involve granting the subject peoples a certain amount of space. You have to very narrowly define what it is that you want. You want political control, you want taxes, I understand that. You want an economic zone, it's all one empire. All that makes sense. What do you care if these people, burn their wives at the funeral and these people eat their, grandchildren, whatever, that's their business. No, you get what I'm saying? It's their business. And so my point is the following. The revolt, as I showed you, emerged from the Roman sources, tell us this, not even the Jewish sources. The revolt of Bar Kochva, which was a biggie, resulted from the fact that Hadrian, with no necessity whatsoever, decided to dump on the Jewish religion. What the heck is his business of prohibiting circumcision? What do you care? Why do you have to go to Jerusalem and Dafka at that place, knock everything down and build a temple to Jupiter? I mean, what's that all about? You see? It was not necessary. And the result was, naturally, you stirred up a hornet's nest. The Jews went nuts. And we can see again from the Roman sources, they killed a heck of a lot of Romans and shook the empire to its foundations. So yeah, the Romans won in the end, cost a lot of money, cost a lot of men, and for what? It's an unnecessary war. Do you follow what I'm saying? The early Roman emperors is very famous, like Augustus and Tiberius, who was nuts, but not as an emperor. He was nuts behind the scenes. He said these emperors is a famous story. When they were the rulers of Judea, they gave orders, and I'm talking about in the first century, in the year 5, 10, 20, 30, 50, 60, they gave orders that the Roman legions, when they're occupying Judea, should sheathe the eagles, cover up all the pagan symbols. Pontius Pilate is a famous story in Josephus. Pontius Pilate, who's so famous or notorious from the New Testament, was a Roman governor of Judea, very anti-Semitic, extremely so, and one time sought to provoke a riot, and he brought into Jerusalem, we're told, 2 shields on which he had painted the portraits of Castor and Pollux, the 2 sons of Tiberius. And the Jews all went crazy, and he said, it's a revolt, you're trying to suppress this, and the Jew says, it's not a revolt, but what are you violating the rules of Jerusalem? This is when the base of Mikdash was still there, and it was a whole scene. He said, I'll kill you all, and they bared their necks and then kill us, but everybody will know it's just a murder on your part. It was not really trying to revolt against Rome. It's something that you're provoking unnecessarily. And the bottom line is somebody got the word to Tiberius, who was partying as always right there in Capri, right near Naples, and doing his favorite activity, which is pushing little girls off a cliff. If you go there today, they show you this. And nevertheless, as I say before, that was Tiberius behind the scenes. But as emperor, as soon as he got a message that there's a whole revolt brewing in Judea because the governor, Pontius Pilate, wanted to bring in the 2 shields, he fired him. It's very famous. How do I know it's famous? Is Philo has this in the letter from Agrippa to Caligula a few years after this happened. I mean, it's a well-known document. It's not from the Gemara or anything, I'm telling you. And does that mean Tiberius was a Jew lover? No, the opposite. Was Augustus a Jew lover? No, the opposite. But they were intelligent CEOs. And so people were saying to Hadrian, I'm sure, in the last year of his life, what was this all about? Why did you get involved in the Vietnam War? It was not necessary. You see? What did you do that for? And he, of course, knew that what we're saying is absolutely true. And this is probably why he dug his heels in more. This might be the reason why he insisted on killing all the rabbis he could get his hands on and all this sort of thing. And as I say, within 3 years, he went down the tubes and nobody missed him. But the poisoned situation, therefore, is relieved with the death of Hadrian. His adopted successor, and Hadrian had no sons. Nerva had no sons. Trajan had no sons. Hadrian has no sons. Antoninus, the next one, has no sons. That's what are called the 4 good emperors. Marcus Aurelius had a son. That's when it went bad. There's a lesson in that. But anyway, the point is that Hadrian, having no sons, adopted. First he adopted this guy who died, and he adopted that guy who died. But by the time the story's over, he adopted what you would call today Senate Majority Leader, which was a smart idea, right? Senate Majority Leader. Chashba, important high-class politician, who had good standing with all the power brokers and things like that. Somebody would be very comfortable with as the emperor, this guy Antoninus, and who was a Roman aristocrat and so forth and so on, a very balanced type individual. And therefore it was a seamless succession. When Hadrian died, Antoninus the Pious said, let's not speak bad of Hadrian, let's all look at the good that he did. Remember who was it in the play Julius Caesar, Mark Antony and so forth. And that is what happened. And so the result was that you got for the next 20-some years, from 138 to 161, so it's almost 25 years, a normal guy on the throne. The Emperor Antoninus Pius, you can even tell his wife was very classy. These were two high-class Roman aristocrats. And by the way, she really was classy. Not only was she, you can even tell from the statue, not only was she a real aristocrat, but she very charitable. This is unusual in the Roman empresses. She spent time taking care of the poor in the hospitals, that sort of Eleanor Roosevelt type, which is rare among your Roman empresses, okay? It's not too common. And the result is that they had a very normal Roman kind of relationship and kind of imperial rule in the best sense. And Antoninus is described in the Roman sources as easing up on the harsh policies that Hadrian in general had imposed in Rome. See, he promised he wouldn't kill any senators, and believe it or not, he never did. This is unusual. And in the provinces as well. And once again, all that means is he was back to normal CEO. Right? Antoninus never left Rome. He was one of these guys that said, I can run the show from over here, provided the policies that are being implemented are intelligent, which is true. And therefore, you need a certain amount of moderation in order to conciliate the various races and provinces that comprise the empire, to enable me to spend the money that I have to spend on defense stuff where we need it, which is on the borders to keep the barbarians out and not to have to suppress local issues. So it's kind of interesting that he had that over there. So he had these policy grounds. He was a mellow fellow, as they say. And really, it's interesting. Antoninus Pius is the most boring of the Roman emperors, which is good. No, in other words, the biographers don't say too much about him, which is good, which means he wasn't crazy. I mean, if you are looking for a movie, you want Caligula, But if you, right? But on the other hand, Antoninus was there for 23 years and ran everything in a very smooth kind of a way. He was one of the most normal of the emperors, conservative in the best sense of the term. As I say before, following the tried and true policies that had put Rome on the map in the first place. And therefore, based on these traditional policies, Antoninus Pius eases up on the Jews. And that's what we're interested in. And so with his accession to the throne, as far as we can tell, the persecution of the sages stops. The prohibition on teaching Torah stops. You see? But on the other hand, he doesn't ease up on Ilia Capitolina. And that's a very Roman kind of balance. In other words, I don't want to let the Jews back into Jerusalem simply because, I'm sure, we all know that with the Judaism, there's no separation of church and state. And if we give them back Jerusalem, who knows what the heck will happen? Maybe they'll try to set up an independent state again and try to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash. So this will become the Roman status quo. You can practice your religion. We're told that Antoninus issued a decree that said like this: the Jews can go back to circumcising provided they do not proselytize. It's very interesting. Seems like that might have been the reason that ticked off Hadrian or these type of guys in the first place, that they saw the circumcision practice not even so much barbaric, which maybe it was, but it's no more barbaric than some of these other things going on in the Roman Empire. I mean, give me a break. The guys with the gladiators are worried about. But anyway, the point, think about that. I'm shocked that there's barbarism going on here. But it became to them that symbol of the marker of separation. And so these Jews are going after non-Jews and then circumcised, and then they're really, so to speak, separating themselves from the families and all the rest of it. And so he basically says like this: no more of that. But Jew on Jew, you do your own thing, which is a very Roman kind of attitude. So politically, we give you nothing, but religiously, we give you everything, and that's the old-fashioned Roman way. It's there, and because of what I just described, because with the accession of Antoninus Pius, who's a famous Roman emperor, things eased up for the Jews. Therefore, Antoninus enters rabbinic literature as the iconic figure of the good Roman, just as Hadrian enters the rabbinic literature as the opposite. To this day, when you read a Gemara or you read a Medrash, they always say, Keshigia Hadrianus Shchikat Samos, when Hadrian made his bones rot, said this and this and this. So this is how we still talk about him. Right? We Jews have a long memory. And when it comes to Antoninus or Antoninus Pius, he's always considered a tzaddik. And the friend of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. And not only that, he was a disciple with their stories in the Gemara and in the Midrashic literature. He's a disciple of Yehuda Nasi. He consults him for advice. And he asks them political questions. They have many philosophical questions over there. How does the body and the soul, when you die, which one gets judged first, and things like this. And, really basic philosophy questions are discussed always there between Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, the rabbi, and Antoninus, the other thing. And the friend, there's even places in the Gemara where they debate the question of whether he converted to Judaism or not, whether they're ger, whether he wore tefillin. It's quite amazing. Now, the problem is, it doesn't work out. Okay, but it's a very, very well-known theme in the Talmudic literature. Let's look at a couple of facts. Hate to spoil the thing, a couple of facts. And we don't have that many facts to go with, but I'm going to show you what's out there. The Gemara tells us, it's very famous, that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who will later on become the head rabbi, the Nasi, was born in the day Rabbi Kiva died. So that would put it to year 135 or so. Antoninus Pius becomes the emperor 3 years later, and was there for 23 years. Which means that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was 25 or something like that when the emperor died. We also know, this is very famous, Antoninus never left Rome. He had an estate nearby. You see, he was a classy guy. His wife ran a classy operation. They really did. They had a high-level court, the right amount of partying, the right amount of philosophizing, the right amount of this. Everything was very balanced and mellow. And he didn't need to go anywhere in provinces. So where did he meet Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, you see? Let alone that there are many stories in the Gemara that he had tunnels from his house to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's house, back and forth in Caesarea. How does this go? Where would it work? There are problems with this. There are, if you want to get down to it, there are a few tales in the Gemara which do date to the time of Antoninus Pius, as far as I can tell. One is extremely interesting, and that's the story of the Roman noblewoman, the Matrona, where the Jews are being persecuted and nothing worked, and finally went to a Roman noblewoman who apparently was sympathetic to Judaism. And you had those types, didn't you? We saw that. And they said, give us some advice what to do. And she said, appeal to their human side and to make a peaceful demonstration. And Ishamayim, we proclaim to heaven, aren't we human beings too? Why are you treating us in a subhuman fashion? All the rest of it. It's very, very interesting. And it kind of worked. So was this the way how do we decode this? Who was this woman? I would love to write a novel, and I'm sure somebody will, and say it was her, because it would kind of fit that Eleanor Roosevelt sort of thing. But, evidence that the Jews, maybe it was, I don't know. But there are a million other Roman noblewomen out there. And this would definitely date from the time of Antoninus Pius. There's another very famous story in the Gemara in Me'ilah, where Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, second generation Tana, this will put him exactly now in the 130s and 140s, visits Rome. And when he's there, he ends up curing the emperor's daughter through some kind of exorcism or something like that. And it's a very interesting story that, here's how the story goes, if I remember correctly. The Romans say as a reward for curing the emperor's daughter, whatever she had, and, maybe she had some mental thing, whatever. So you can go into the treasure house. And we were there, weren't we, in Rome not long ago when we did our trip to Italy. Not far from the Colosseum was a place where they had literally the treasure house where they stored all their decrees and all their goodies and things like that. Vespasian built it. And you can take whatever you want out of there. And that means that Shimon Yochai was allowed to go in. He could take, the menorah out or the paroches or something from the base. Imagine the incalculable value of all this. But it's like a Hasidic tale. Because what he does is he sees a decree against the Jews, maybe one of Hadrian's decrees, and he said, this one I want to take home and tear up. And they said, okay. Once again, it's a story about what? The easing up of conditions for the Jews in the wake of the death of Hadrian. You see? So these stories we can date to the degree that we can to the time of Antoninus Pius. These other Yehuda stories don't work so well. The next emperor after him was the famous Marcus Aurelius, one of the most famous of the Roman emperors, and is unique in many respects, although overestimated in my opinion often, but unique in respect because he was a philosopher. Get it? And it was a Stoic philosopher of all things, and that's very much unlike most of your Roman emperors. You notice he was more Greek in this regard than Roman, although he was 100% Roman from the aristocracy. And Marcus Aurelius is famous for being the emperor for 20 years and 19 years, and publishing or writing one of the classics of philosophy, Stoic philosophy, called the Meditations, which is still around today and published all the time, as a favorite with many people. And it's really a cool book. Stoic philosophy is kind of interesting because it's the opposite of Epicureanism. They're not into partying. The whole idea is like this: what do you need that for? You know, you have no life unless you smoke. What are you smoking for? What do you have to go to parties for? Why do you care what people think about you? No, I'm asking a question about you. Of Stoics is like, why does it bother you what people think about you? You can handle anything. It's all up to you. It's a very interesting kind of way. And the kind of person I'm talking about, therefore, is not into luxury because he wants to move past that. Is not into, all these fancy. Now, this is not your typical Roman emperor who I can tell you did not live an impoverished lifestyle. But Marcus Aurelius sleeps on the floor because he said, like, why not? Get it? What's your issue? You say it hurts, you can train yourself to anything. Right? You take a cold shower, why not? Right? You can do it. Just tell me, you're such a slave to your luxury and to your sensitivity. Now, this is very untypical of the Roman emperors, and because it is, there are those who say, especially the Doris Hashem says, yes, that's Antoninus, you see, because that's the type of guy that would fit very good with Rabbi Yehuda. You follow? It's very intriguing. Look, here's I'll read you the first page, very famous. Marcus Aurelius writes in the what do you call it? In the Meditations. He says, people I owe hakar satov to, people I owe gratitude to, who taught me important things in life. From my grandfather, I learned good morals and governing my temper. That's important in an emperor. It's important in any of us. From the reputation and the memory of my father, I learned modesty and a manly character. From my mother, I learned piety, well, he's a Roman, and beneficence, which is to do chesed, and abstinence not only from evil deeds, but from evil thoughts. And further, simplicity in my way of living, far removed from the habits of the rich. See, I have one of those kind of. This is not your typical Roman emperor. From my great-grandfather, I learned not to go into public schools. In other words, he had tutors. You pick up, look, I hate to say it, you pick up a lot of bad habits in school. Right? Not in Baltimore, of course, but elsewhere. And to have good teachers at home, and to know that this is what people should spend money liberally on. From my governor, meaning my tutor, I learned not to be of the green team or the blue team in the circus. In other words, not to get nuts into sports. Right? A lot of your life gets wasted because you all the Narishkeit, whether the Orioles or the Yankees. Oh, don't say that, right? You see? He says this, and from him too I learned endurance of labor and to want little and to work with my hands and not to meddle with other people's affairs and not to listen to slander. From Diogenes, I learned not to busy myself about trifling things and not to believe magicians and jugglers and incantations and exorcisms, okay, and so on and so forth. From my grandmother, I received the impression that my character required improvement. Did any of you have a grandmother like that? And discipline. And I learned also not to be led astray to sophistic emulation or writing on speculative matters and so on and so on and such and such. And, and he says that from this one I learned I could sleep on a board. And so it would be very intriguing and therefore understandable. You'll find it sometimes from history books. And there are when they say, Yehuda was friends with the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Because since he was the adopted son of Antoninus, his real name was Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Pius. And and then it goes like that. And it's kind of cool. And the years would work, wouldn't they? Because Rabbi Yehuda was born in 130, so then Marcus Aurelius would become the emperor by the time he's like 25. And then you could already see, because with what other emperor could you have a philosophical conversation? Give me a break. Right? Who, Tiberius? Nero? Constantine? These soldiers, give me a, However, it doesn't work. I hate to pop the balloon. The facts don't work out. Marcus Aurelius, we know where he was. He spent almost the whole time. Let's go back to the map of the Roman Empire. Here we go. Marcus Aurelius spent almost all of his reign fighting off barbarian invasions all through here, constantly. Okay? Now, it's true, once or maybe twice, he had a revolt here, so he had to go down and suppress the revolt. So he passed through here once and twice. He spent most of his reign, I'm going somewhere with this, he spent most of his reign battling huge barbarian invasions. Okay? Do we have that piece? Let's, look at this. This I found this on YouTube. This is like a simulation of what happened all the time. I mean, this was every day, all throughout Germany and all through the Danube area. They're battling the barbarians, with attacks and counterattacks. At first, the Romans got beaten a bunch of times, lost a couple armies. Then they had to replenish them. In order to pay for it, he had to sell all of his china and his silver. And it's really rough. And this was typical of what was going on in his time. He doesn't have time to have philosophical conversation with Rabbi Yehuda. Okay? The peoples that you see over here were called, there's even a better point. The peoples you see over here, the great barbarian groups, were the Marcomanni and the Quadi in that time. What we would call today the Czechs, the Slovaks, and the Hungarians, whatever. Now, I mean it. That's where they're located. And big, huge battles in there. He passed through Judea once, and he met a couple of Jews. And according to Ammianus Marcellinus, he's like this. He says, boy, these Jews, the Marcomanni and the Quadi are almost as bad as the Jews. You get what I'm saying? In other words, he didn't have too high opinion of the Jews, and being a Greek philosopher, he wouldn't. So it doesn't work so well to say that he was around, even though it's very tempting. He didn't hang out for any length of time in Israel to have all these conversations. Now, what do I know? Maybe Rabbi Nasi went and visited him on the Danube. Anything's possible, but it's very unlikely. Believe it or not, the best speculation, if there was any, of who Antoninus is will be a couple emperors later, because he left it. The way it works is like this. Marcus Aurelius, unfortunately, had a son. He left it a son who was a jerk, that was Commodus. After 12 years, Commodus was assassinated. The guy who assassinated was assassinated, Pertinax was assassinated by the others. Then there was a huge bunch of battles between one general and the other, and finally the bloodiest of the generals, Septimius Severus, grabbed power, and he killed all the rivals, and he became the emperor for the next couple of years, and after him, his son, Caracalla, who was called Caracalla the Cruel. There are traditions that say that these two guys, although they're pretty vicious and kill people right and left, like Jews. It's interesting. There are inscriptions in certain synagogues in ancient times and church records, Mefarshim of the church fathers on the book of Daniel. It's kind of interesting. And Caracalla was told when he was very young, he had a Jewish boyfriend, and I think somebody whipped him, and he was real angry at the father of the Jewish boyfriend, things like that. In other words, he seems to have liked Jews. And sometimes in the Yerushalmi he's called Antoninus ben Asweiris, and this would be Severus. So there's arguments in favor of that, in which case Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi would not have been born in 135, otherwise he'd have to be in his 70s and 80s when he met the emperor. I don't know, anything's possible. I'm trying to show you once again that if you want to get down to facts, all we know for sure, or all that seems to come out of all this, if you get out of the chronology problem, is there was some guy named Antoninus who was a good Roman, maybe he was a governor, maybe he was a general, maybe he was an emperor, but something good happened to repair or vastly improve the relationships between the Jewish people on the one hand, and here I'm speaking about the rabbis, and the Roman authorities on the other hand. That's the bottom line. Some kind of definite improvement occurred in the Roman treatment of the Jews after the death of Hadrian. Partially, as I said before, this was due to old-fashioned imperial policy. If you saw that movie I just showed you before, they're so busy fighting along here all the time, all here, and then the Parthians over here. Are you really want to stir up this hornet's nest again? Let's have another Bar Kochva revolt. That's a great idea. You see? And so, based on these kind of notions, a kind of pacification policy towards the Jews along with the other peoples of the empire seems to have ensued. And this would be definitely increased after the year 222 when the Iraqis are conquered by the Iranians. Here's Ardashir, the first Iranian emperor. This is like, what's Ahmadinejad, the Sasanian Persian Empire. And believe me, from then on it got really bad for the Romans. They had trouble with the Parthians for a couple hundred years, and then the Persians came along. Oh my God, for the next 400 years, the Persians, every chance they do, try to swallow up the Roman Empire, and they're constantly invading and reaching the Mediterranean, killing and pillaging and all this kind of stuff. And so the Romans really had their hands full at that time, plus they had their hands full on the north with the other barbarians. So it wasn't too much fun to be a Roman emperor during this period. That's what I'm trying to tell you. In that case, the Jews are moved to the back burner. People are not so interested or giving so much attention to the Jewish situation, which is good. And finally, the Jews are the least of the problems of Rome. And partially, and very interesting, it's also due to the fact that it's starting to dawn on these dummies in Rome, the Jews aren't your threat, it's the Christians. The ones that's picking up the real converts in big numbers is not the Jewish Jews, it's the Christians. The Jews are the ones who insist on circumcision. The Christians don't. The Jews are the ones who insist you got to keep kosher and Shabbos and all these other things, and Taras Mishpacha and who knows what. The Christians don't. And so the ones who are building up following big right and left, who's your real problem, and by the 3rd century, by the time you get to the 200s, the Romans start to put 2 and 2 together, and the Jews appear more and more just to be another quaint little people with some self-important ideas, maybe, but so what? You understand? So what? I'm sure the Amish think that they're the elect of God and the number ones on earth. So what? Doesn't bother you? So if you have that kind of sense of proportion, you start to see that a certain kind of modus vivendi starts to work itself out by the time you get to the late 100s and afterwards. And as Caracalla, who I showed you before, gives the Jews civil rights in 212, meaning gave Jews and others, but Jews too, a Roman citizenship, which was a privileged position for many centuries, which was only given out to non-Romans on a very small basis. Once in a while, that gives you right to a lawyer, habeas corpus, things like that. I mean it. And so and Caracalla is sort of like an Abraham Lincoln type business, where he gives free citizenship to the Jews, which means the Jews they may be a little bit weird and maybe a little self-important, but they're not Roman citizens. And not only that, but he opens up after him public offices. So Jews can run for mayor, city council, and this sort of thing. And they do. And not only that, after a while, people no longer, and by the time you get to the middle of the 200s and afterwards, people no longer wanted to hold these offices because they're a pain in the neck. They take away from the time you can spend on your business, all the rest of it. And we have imperial decrees from a Roman emperor saying, no, the Jews and the others, they all have to stay at the post. And, the guy has to run again for mayor and things like this because we need the machinery of basic administration to keep running. And so more and more the Jews, of all things, are being integrated totally into the structure of the running of the Roman Empire, at least at the provincial level, which is where a lot of the action happened. And so what I'm trying to show you is, contrary to popular belief, there never was a Roman expulsion of the Jews from Palestine. Let's contrast that. When the first temple was destroyed, and Tisha B'Av is tomorrow night, when the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, by the time all that's over, with Gedaliah and so forth, within a couple of months, every last Jew was kicked out of Israel. The country was, as the Germans say, Judenrein. It was free of Jews. And that was what we call the Babylonian exile. It really was an exile. Now let's contrast that. When Titus destroyed the temple the second time, as you've seen here, what I've been talking about, plenty of Jews were left in Israel. There were a lot killed, but many weren't. Even after the Bar Kochva rebellion, when a whole lot of Jews were killed, especially in central Israel, and it may even be that central Israel, Judea as we call it, was depopulated of Jews, more or less. The Galil was not, and went on to do the Mishnah, the Tanoim, the Yerushalmi, the Amoraim. In other words, it was a significant center of Judaism, Jewish culture, all under the Roman Empire. The Romans never did. It's one of those urban myths, It's a fallacy. The Romans never did expel or exile the Jews. So if we use the term the Roman exile, and we do, and we talk about Golus Edom, the Golus of Esav, which is always the rabbinical way of talking about the Romans, we don't mean it in the typical sense that they just picked the area up and moved somewhere else. We must use it in a more attenuated and more sophisticated sense. And it's kind of a very strange phenomenon in which the Jews live in Israel, but they can't go to Jerusalem. Right? You're there, but you can't touch it. It's an interesting kind of notion. But this is the modus vivendi that works itself out there. And it's very strikingly similar of the times today that you and I live with. Look at this. This is from 67. the Jewish soldiers in June of 67, standing to the right of Moscow Omar, they even put up an Israeli flag for a few minutes and things like this. As you know, that Tzahal conquered the Temple Mount, and then we didn't. And then we gave it back because they're afraid. And they're afraid till today. So it's very much like the Golos said to them, we're there, but you're not there. It's right in front of you, but you can't touch it. It's a funny kind of notion of Golos, but who says that there's one variation on that subject? Maybe there are multiple variations. In fact, what I'm arguing is there are multiple variations on the concept of Golos. Don't be unilinear and think that it means you pick somebody up and exile them, from country A to country B. There's various forms, exquisite torture and whatever you want to call it in the psychological sense, in which, you can be there and you're not there. Or you can be there and you're reminded every day that you're not the boss, you're not the bala boss. And these are the times we live in. We're all pained by this, but this is what's the solution? So that's what emerges as the basic reality of Jewish life in the wake of the Bar Kochva revolt in the 100s, the 200s, 300s, 400s, and so forth. You see? And so on the one hand, the Jews are becoming more, integrated into the Roman Empire, but on the other hand, on Roman terms. You can practice your religion, provided your religion does involve physical attempts to rebuild the temple and enter Jerusalem. Do something else. Write the Gemara, do something else. You see? And that is, of course, what happens. Eretz Yisrael, as I just told you, remains the center of Tannaitic activities after the Bar Kochva rebellion for another 80 or 100 years. If Bar Kochva ends in the 130s, 135, so think about what I'm about to tell you. We talk about the Tanoim, the great rabbis who wrote the first layer of the Talmud, the Mishnah, the Tosefta, the Midrash Halacha, those kind of fundamental works of Judaism, Jewish law. They all lived right at that time. The first generation lived before the Bar Kochva rebellion. The second generation of Tanoim lived right during and through it. These are people like Reb Meir, Rabbi Huda, Shimon Gamliel, Nehemiah. People you encounter all the time in these tales. Reb Shimon ben Yochai. We know more or less the cast of characters. The same 5, 10, 12 people, and others, but the same 5 and 10 you see most often. And they lived through the 120s, 130s, 140s, all the rest of it. They lived in a time when this had to be put back together. I told you last time about Elisha ben Avuya ben Acher, who went over to the Romans, and then he didn't. In other words, and then the persecution was over, and he felt a little bit stupid, and you find Rameir trying to bring him back. When does this happen? This happens in the 130s and 140s. You put a time on it. The integration that I'm talking about is reflected in a very well-known story. I'm sure many of you know it. That Rav Shimon ben Yochai, right, the famous Shimon ben Yochai, ends up hiding in a cave because he was overheard criticizing Rome. Correct? And he cussed him out and all the rest of it. You all know that story, I'm sure. What did his son do for a living? He worked for the Roman police. Isn't that right? He was a detective for Roman police, going after Jewish gangsters. There are no Jewish gangsters today, of course, but 2,000 years ago there were Jewish gangsters. And he was criticized for this by others. They said, Chometz ben yayin, you're vinegar to son of wine, meaning, how can a guy like you work for the Romans, all the rest of it? And it's a whole famous dialogue where he basically made the argument, getting rid of a criminal element is a good thing, not a bad thing. And, they said, no, you shouldn't cooperate with the police. But this is a debate that will go on forever, even today. What's the story? You find some teacher or whatever abusing somebody. You go to the police, you don't go to the police. It's always a hot button issue, you see? And so these kind of funny dynamics constitute the Jewish reality in this period. And then you have the third generation of Tanoim, who are the ones that actually make the Mishnah and some of these other things. Israel, even in its battered and bloody state, and even deprived of Jewish presence in the center of Israel and confined to the Galilee, still remains in the 100s the hotspot for Judaism, for Torah in the world. It's interesting. The rabbis, of course, have to react to the suppression of Bar Kochva catastrophe by once again de-emphasizing Messianic politics and concentrating on religion. That's why, as I tried to show you, it's frustrating last week, you don't find things in Chazal about the Bar Kochva rebellion, because that is not what they wanted to talk about. You see? That is not a productive idea if you're living in the 140s and 150s. It's not going to do any good. You see? They may talk about the sad massacres at Beitar, but we're not going into why he thought it was the Mashiach, all the rest of it. Keep your big fat mouth shut and just try to survive over here. As Rabbi Yeshua said, it's enough that you stuck your head in the mouth of the lion and you live to tell about it. They set their goal, clearly, the rabbinic elite, in this generation, to collecting and editing the oral law. And at the beginning, what I call the text process of taking what was the Torah Sheba'al Peh. I'm sure everybody knows the law was in oral form because we're opposed, I repeat, we're opposed to putting it down in any kind of fixed text and doing just that. And that's a process anyone who knows that begins with the second generation of Tanas and culminates and crystallizes in the third. So that's why we say, for those who will remember this, Stam Mishnah Rameir, right? Which many don't understand. Stam Mishnah means that, I'll tell you what it really means. It means that the original version of the Mishnah that we have today dates to the time of Rameir, meaning he lived at this time in second generation, and then it's re-edited by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. And Stam Toses is Reb this, and it's re-edited then. And Stam, Micholta is this, and Stam Sifra is this, meaning the process of putting everything down into some kind of a text and turning Judaism into what it is today, a religion of books, commences now in the wake of the Bar Kochva Rebellion as a kind of rechanneling of the efforts of the people and the best thinkers away from politics, because the Roman Empire ain't going anywhere, my friends. Let's not do this again, into setting up what we would call the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the Talmud and everything that goes along with that. By the time you get to the next generation, the reign of Marcus Aurelius, in other words, you have the third generation, as we call Tanaim. These are the sons of the second. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is the son of Shimon Gamliel, and so-and-so is the son of Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon. This elite over there, they're engaged in the final texting, if I could, but fixing the text of significant portions of the oral law. In other words, the energies of the Jewish people turn away from politics and they turn into scholarship. Okay? Is this not the basic thrust of Jewish history for the next 2,000 years, more or less? Yes. Right? Isn't that what ends up defining Jewish culture? You ask anybody on the street, what's Jewish culture? You don't automatically think of Bar Kochva. You think of people doing intellectual work, religious or secular. You see? There's a process, as I said before, that assumes front row in Jewish life after this. And they're not happy about what they do to the Torah. They didn't want to do this business of trying to fix it in some kind of a text. But as the Talmud tells us itself, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and these others, they said, Eis lasas Hashem efer Torasecha. That is emergency. There's a time one has to act for the Lord by breaking some of the laws. They have to be mefer, they have to change or violate some of the laws of the Torah. One of the laws of the Torah being don't put the oral law into any kind of a text form, and it says it's got to happen. And of course they did it. So what I'm trying to tell you is that just as the destruction of the first temple resulted in the canonization of the written Torah, the destruction of the second temple, and particularly the crushing of the Bar Kochva rebellion, ends up in the Talmud. Right? A common book. What was the Bible? A common book held by everybody, the same text. That's what the Talmud is. Once upon a time, if it's an oral law, lots of Jews did different things in different ways all over the place, and it was okay. Anyone who's the slightest bit of familiarity with the Talmud knows that you'll have debates in the Gemara. Are you allowed to do this on Shabbos, or you're not allowed to do this on Shabbos? Well, guess what? The one who says you're allowed to do it where he came from, that's what they did. And the one who says you're not to where he came from, they're not. Do we find in the Gemara Chulin, for example, that they argue whether certain foods are kosher or not, and this one said that it is kosher, and this one not kosher? Well, what does that mean? In some places they held this was okay, and other places they held differently. Now, this is not a chaos. Nobody said you can eat a ham sandwich. Nobody said you can light a match on Saturday afternoon. There are certain basics that are out there. Nobody says go buy a chametz something or other in the middle, right after you finish the Seder. But having said that, there's a lot of little details out there which allow for a lot of variation. And we go back to the argument of the centrifugal versus the centripetal, the forces that pull apart versus the forces that hold together. And obviously the reaction to the disasters, and what we call the Golus Edom, the disasters of the suppression of Bar Kochva rebellion are, let's try to get more and more uniformity. Let's get the same book, at least. Let's turn this to a text. So there's two opinions that are out there that are permitted on the subject of whether this food is kosher, and we're going to paskin, as they say, we're going to rule like this one, and from now on all the Jews should go this way. This is a process of grand uniformitization of Jews, which takes many centuries, and doesn't, by no means happens right away in the first or second or third century. It's a process that goes on for many, many centuries, but we know what the train looks like by the time it comes out of the tunnel. You have this uniformed thing called Talmudic Judaism, which is with us today. And it constitutes the portable fatherland, as Heine puts it. And that's why me, myself, and I, and you also, if you go anywhere in the world, no matter what community it is, if you come into a bunch of Jews, and if they are observant, meaning if they still follow the Talmudic rules, you know what they're going to do on Tisha B'Av, more or less, don't you? Right? The words might not be 100% the same, but there'll be a lot of uniformity even in the words. But you know that it's going to be tennis shoes, right? They're going to be fasting, of course. All the sorts of things that go along with that. And why? I'm living in Baltimore, Maryland. This guy's living in Yemen. That guy's living in Mumbai. And whatever. How do they have anything to do about it? They got that same book. Right? There are arguments about what the book means. Well, gee, I'm shocked Jews have arguments, but basically, that is the Jewish people's sort of inchoate reaction to the suppression of their statehood on a long-term kind of basis. And so the more time goes on, and Jews realize that Rome is not disappearing soon, the greater the crystallization of the process of creating this portable fatherland. A constitution for the Jewish people, which does enable Jews scattered all over the world to remain a nation in exile, something which stumps our enemies and bothers them to no end down to this day. In the second, now by the way, the less people become observant of this stuff, the greater centrifugal force occurs, and the less they have to do with one another, and then that disintegrates and the Jewish people fall apart. Right? Correct? I mean, we all know this is the central existential crisis of Judaism today. It's true that I can walk into a house in London and celebrate Tisha B'Av. There's another house I can walk into, and they're Jewish, and I never heard of Tisha B'Av. And in Baltimore, Maryland as well. And that is a dangerous business if you're talking about long-term survival of the group. Now, in the 2nd century, after the Bar Kochva revolt, and listen closely, there's still a Jewish church. Right? There was no Jewish state that was destroyed by the Romans. But the emperors do allow a Jewish church, which is a structured religious hierarchy with people at the top giving orders to those at the bottom, on a religious and not a political basis. And this Jewish church reaches its zenith a generation or so after the Bar Kochva rebellion, interestingly. Right? In the 3rd generation of Tanaim, led Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and his buddy Antoninus, whoever that was. The significance, because it does matter, but it almost doesn't matter. Whoever this Antoninus was, the positive relations, for whatever reason, there are lots of theories, that he enjoyed with Yehuda Nasi enables what? The Jewish church to function. The Nasi, as they call him, the head of the Jewish religion. Hear what I said? Head of the Jewish religion. To be operating and rich and powerful. And it is the Jewish church that issues the Mishnah. That's what gives it its authority. It wasn't written by one person. That's not the point. The point is that whole group, the patriarchate, if you wish, the college of all the rabbis, the Sanhedrin, that's what it was, said, this is the book. There were other Mishnahs out there without getting too technical, but they have gotten forgotten. And this one is the one that's out there because the Romans allowed this and they were okay with it because the Mishnah had nothing to do with politics. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was very careful, believe me, to stay in good relations with the Roman emperor. And he was no fool, obviously, and he never pushed the envelope too far. There, once again, even though there are stories in the Midrash and in the Gemara that Antoninus said, let me be your servant and let me serve you dinner and things like that, it's also true that I remember this from in all these many Midrashim I told you about Yaakov and Esav in Parshas Toldos that how's it go now? Rabbi Yehuda, this is how it goes. I don't have it in front of me. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi had a secretary, Rabbi Afes, and he wrote him writing a letter to Antoninus, and it said, from Judah the prince to Antoninus the emperor. And Rabbi Yehuda Nasi says, no, let's redraft it to Antoninus the emperor from your humble servant Judah. And he says, why do you abase yourself so much? He says, look at the parsha of the week. Komar Avdecha Yaakov. Right? Yaakov found it prudent when he's dealing with Esav not to flaunt any kind of pride. Which, once again, you have to understand the historical import of these stories, which is Yehuda Nasi was rich and powerful, all the rest of it, but he was very prudent and very, diplomatic, and he realized the delicateness of his situation, and that sort of epitomizes the position of Judaism within the Roman Empire after the suppression of the Bar Kochva rebellion. After the 1st century, we get the Amoraim, right? What they call the period of Talmud Shalom, Rabbi Yochanan, Reish Lakish. You've heard of people like that, of course, and many others. And so my point is, even in the 200s, 100 years after the Bar Kochva rebellion ended in such blood, Israel, at least the Galilee, is still a hot spot of Judaism. Except now there are two. One's in Babylonia. All right, now there are two, one in Iraq. The period of Amoraim starts in the 200s, more or less. The 200s, the 300s, and the 400s, and now there's two. That's unusual. We never had that before. They still possess great charismatic or religious authority. What do I mean when I say charismatic? They're not the Nazis necessarily, somebody Rabbi Yochanan, but he's like a Rosh Yeshiva, as we would say today. Famous rabbis who, by their charisma, by the force of their personality, command huge veneration well beyond the boundaries of Israel. And so based on this charismatic authority, Israel still retains a kind of centrality in Jewish life. And it's also true, as I told you before, that the church continues chugging on throughout the 200s and into the 300s, meaning there are Nazis. There's Rabbi Yehuda Nasi the first, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi the second, this and that and the other. They weren't all the same madrega, they're all the same level, but nevertheless, the Roman Empire is okay with some guy calling himself the top Jew, and the other Jewish communities, like in places like Rome and Alexandria and elsewhere, send taxes to him voluntarily. They send taxes to him, and so you've got a state within a state, and provided they're very careful never to overstep the boundaries, and there's no mention of Bar Kochva-ism anymore, and there's no question about rebellion against the Roman Empire anymore, not the slightest question. This is sort of like a co-opted elite, in other words, he can do all the religious stuff he wants, provided you keep your nose out of politics, and they do, and provided you don't mess with the status quo, and you don't say, hey, I want to go visit Jerusalem, and let's talk about replacing the temple over here with a Jewish temple. They never, ever bring that up. Everybody knows it's the elephant on the table. This is what the Jews long for and what they yearn for, but you're not allowed to say it. That's the rules of the game. It's Golos Edom. Kol Ma'av D'Chol Yaakov. Get used to it. And they do. And so what I'm trying to show you is not only are the Jews not exiled by the Romans, but Israel, for a long time after the Bar Kochva Rebellion, centuries, continues to be, in many respects, what it always was, the center and the capital of Jewish life for Jews around the world. The Romans do allow this, as I said before. And this lasts for at least 100 years, through what they call the crisis of the 3rd century, which means that Rome in the 200s started to have a whole string of really dumb, stupid emperors, one after the other. They made Tiberius look good. They were real losers, and the Roman Empire couldn't afford that. You saw the borders over there and the constant strain with the invasion of the barbarians. And the bottom line is Rome was collapsing from inside. There are midrashim, if you know how to read them properly, in which you see that some of the rabbis are expecting that Rome's going to go down the tubes, and the Mashiach is around the corner, and all sort of thing. In Reisim Malchius Metagr Zuazu Tzapei Lekvosov Shel Mashiach, if you see great nations battling, look for the footsteps of the Messiah. They said Rome's going down, all that, but it didn't happen. In the late 200s, when the politicians were all idiots one after another, two generals took over, first Aurelian and after him Diocletian. They were generals from the army, and they were very tough, rough guys, and they fought and crushed all the opposition and beat the barbarians and restored the Roman Empire. Gave it another lease of life, for better or worse, depending on your point of view. But by that time, Diocletian is famous, even Aurelian, but Diocletian is for terribly persecuting the Christians. He is the guy that fed them to the lions, right? Not the Jews, though. There is an interesting story about Diocletian. I won't go into it and the rabbi, but it's like a piquant story. The reason is he had bigger fish to fry. The Jews are not the problem. The Jews, that's a weird group, right? Of which the Roman Empire has plenty. The Christians are really bad news. And Diocletian was right, because after he died, the next big emperor that came along a little bit after him was Constantine. Well, you know what that means, right? I'll tell you what Constantine means. Bad news for the Jews. Correct? Because when the Roman Empire and the Constantine switches to Christian, then we're dealing with a different issue, right? It's no longer the Roman Empire with a lot of different gods and religions, and they look at the Jews just as a little nutball group, as they say, with self-importance, all the rest. That's nothing. Now you get the Christians, whose basic definition of themselves is they are the real Jews. And how come the other Jews don't acknowledge them as the Jews? That shows you how bad the Jews are, right? And they killed Jesus, as you know. You see? And they did all kind of other things, and the Jews are disgusting. So much so that when they have the Council of Nicaea under Constantine to decide on the ABCs of Christianity, one of the first things he says is, let's move it from Saturday to Sunday, because we don't want the Jewish Sabbath. By the way, the Jews also say go to Sunday, but that's true. But nevertheless, you start to see the crystallization of what we know of the Christianity, which will have, from the time of Constantine on, and especially in the Roman Empire, a very pronounced anti-Semitism. Okay? Little by little, they will start to strip away those rights and integrated status that the Jews had attained in the wake of the Bar Kochva Rebellion, but before the rise of Christianity. That's when the trouble happens, and they're the ones who mess up Israel. Because Constantine is bad news. He died, I don't remember, in the 330s or something like that. But without going to too many details, by the time you get to the 360s, Ariscanus, who's the famous general, he gets in an argument with the Jews over something or other, and he kills them all. I mean, you ever hear the Talmud Yerushalmi? Of course you have. How come you don't hear of anybody after the year 363? And the answer is, Ariscanus, who I bet you never heard of, Ariscanus has a campaign. He exterminates the yeshivas. That's the end of Yerushalmi, baby. You understand? It's over. And he kills all the rabbis. Which, by the way, is the explanation. When you go to Israel, they always wonder. You go to some of these synagogues, and you say, how come they have Zeus and all the pagan symbols on the floor? You know what I'm talking about, right? Don't they? And I'm sure the guides tell you this, that, and the other. And, you can imagine what I think of tour guides. The fact is that these things go from the 5th century, from the 400s and all the rest of them. And there were Jews in Israel, as we'll see them in the Romans. Even the Christians don't kick them out of Israel, but they crush them. And so if there is Judaism, and there is in Judaism, it's a big Amaratzish Judaism. They don't know anything. There were a lot of syncretism. And the Jews, well-meaning, like a little bit like I was speaking about in Romania this morning. We were in Washington. So he says, well-meaning, but they pick up a lot of stuff from the neighbors, and you end up with a kind of funny Judaism in which they are quote-unquote Orthodox Jews, and they are, but they don't mind incorporating many pagan motifs into their even synagogue structure, and they don't get that there's anything wrong with it. You follow? It's kind of interesting, but if you don't know the history of that time, you're not going to get it. Now, basically, the Jewish Torah is destroyed by Ariscanus, and the Patriarchate is destroyed by Theodosius in the 420s. The Emperor Theodosius abolishes after Rabbi Gamliel, I don't know, the 5th or 6th or something like that. When he dies, the Emperor Theodosius has no more patriarchs, meaning I'm closing down the Jewish church. And between these two guys, between the 360s and the early 400s, Sanhedrin disappears. And that's what we've been going ever since. So the Romans crushed the Bar Kochva Rebellion. They give the Jews 200 years of respite. Then they go after them again under the guise of Christianity. And they break the church in addition to the state, which really gave the Jewish people an existential crisis because they're used to having some kind of authority structure. I know you and I are not, but that's why we've gone through 1700 years without it. Get it? Actually, the definition of Jewish today is no structure. Correct? Whatever rabbi you want. You don't want any rabbi, don't do that either, Who was it? Will Rogers said, I'm not a member of an organized political party, I'm a Democrat, So so he says, I'm not the member of any organized religion, I'm an Orthodox Jew, There's a lot of truth to that, correct? So, and no one even, could you imagine? There's nothing preventing all the big rabbis of the world today, nothing politically, preventing the big rabbis of the world today getting together and reconstituting the Sanhedrin. Ain't never going to happen, right? You're not going to get the Satmar and the Lubavitch and their Israel and the YU and the this and that and the other, and they're never going to get in a room. You see? Nothing's stopping it. It ain't going to happen. And so, ever since they broke the church in the late 4th century, early 5th century, that part didn't work either. The Jews had to develop a culture, sort of organically, in which they could operate uniquely among nations and groups and races, in which they had to survive as a people with a common culture and a common religion without a state and without a church. I don't know of any other group like that. The others, like the Armenians, they didn't have a state, but they have a church. You get it? The Jews had to do without both, which is kind of interesting that we somehow, whether we pulled it together, in spite of all the imperfections that characterize Jewish life as we know. That, as I say before, the result of all this is that the existence of Jews in Israel continues all the way through the Roman Empire, but tenuously. And it ceases to be the capital of the Jewish people, and it will not be the capital of Jewish people at least for 1,000 years. Get it? All throughout the rest of history, in the Middle Ages, the headquarters of Judaism is elsewhere. And for the next couple of years, it's Bavel, Babylonia. That's the Babylonian Talmud. And afterwards, you heard of the Gaonim, with the famous yeshivas that were there. That became the place where Judaism has its headquarters. Later in the Middle Ages, you hear of famous scholars. They don't live in Israel. Rashi lived in France. Maimonides lived in Spain and Egypt, and so forth. Correct? Dvarim Rottenberg lived in Germany. Nobody lives in Israel. Where are the Jews in Israel? There are Jews in Israel, but it's a backwater. This is a radical difference in Jewish history, characterized what we call the late antiquity and beginning of Middle Ages. And as I said before, the action is elsewhere. It's interesting. There will be attempts of Jews later in the Middle Ages, like in the 900s, to try to reassert and say, we're the Israeli Jews, everybody should listen to us. And they'll be suppressed by the Babylonian Gaonim, like Sadiq and the others. They say, no, that's the old Israel. You guys don't count. You see? Don't give me any of this. But all this, of course, happens long after Bar Kochva. So I move now to my concluding thoughts. Bar Kochva, think about what I'm about to tell you. An interesting thing about Kochva, the most interesting or impressive messianic figure in Jewish history. Give me a more impressive one. Never claimed to be Mashiach. Not as far as we know. If you look closely, he says, Rabbi Akiva said he's Mashiach. It's interesting, right? You don't hear that this guy stepped forward and said, I'm the man, and give it to me. The way every other false Messiah does, correct? There are guys standing up, I'm sure when this lecture is over, people stand up and say, I'm the Mashiach. It happens all the time, okay? And you don't wait for others to put, Bar Kochva didn't do this. It's interesting. Rabbi Akiva, the Rambam's famous, Maimonides' famous version of Messiah, based on his reading of the Bar Kochva story, still stands today as our most important bulwark against false messiahs. People like Shabtai Tzvi. Because Maimonides, the Rambam, said that he never claimed to be Mashiach Bar Kochva. Rabbi Akiva thought he was a Mashiach, but there's a reason. Because there's a certain checklist. And somebody has to do things to gain some kind of attraction, some kind of traction as a Mashiach. Who is Bar Kochva? The Rambam says. Well, he was a Jewish leader. He looked for a while like he's kicking the Romans out. He looked for a while he's capturing Jerusalem and rebuilding the temple. He looked for a while from guy. You saw he was concerned in those letters that they found in the Dead Sea Scrolls with Lulav and Esrog during Sukkot. He was a good Jew. He was a heroic Judah Maccabee type, as I call it. He might have won against the Romans. It could have been. He was going to restore the kingdom of Israel. You saw the coins, Cherut Yerushalayim, it says. So he was doing all these things. So it's perfectly understandable that some of the Rabbi Akiva said, oh, that is the Mashiach. So the Rambam then says very famously, you want to claim to be a Messiah? Let's see you do some of the stuff on the checklist. That's already a different story. Then they give you Terutzim, don't they? They ask Shabtai Tzvi, he says, where's the rebuilding of the state of Israel? It's all happening Kabbalistically. You understand? It's like Bernie Madoff. It's all happening somewhere else. You see? And every other would-be Messiah. Right? Somebody claims the Messiah or he gets followers say this guy's the Messiah. No problem with it. Do me a Bar Kochva. Let's see. Do your stuff. You get the Arabs out of Israel to agree to move, I sign up. Right? You rebuild the temple and you get the Arabs to go along with that, I will shine your shoes. That's right? But if you don't, then shut up. Put up or shut up. And so Bar Kochva emerges in this reading, very interestingly, as a kind of, as I say before, a bulwark figure against false messianism. That's how the Rambam reads it. And this is probably the most constructive legacy, to my mind, of the Bar Kochva experience. We Jews have had our share of false messiahs, and we're not through with them, I'm sure. How do you know? The problem when it comes to matters of faith is anybody can fake anybody out and say, oh, you don't believe me? There's something wrong with you. You have little faith. How do you separate that out from the phonies who are a dime a dozen? And the answer is well, look at the Bar Kochva, look at, Rabbi Akiva didn't pick anybody until the guy did stuff. And seemed, at least, to validate the claim. I think, as I said before, this ought to be viewed as the most constructive legacy of the Bar Kochva experience. We're not sure, till this day, how to deal with Mashiachism, Messianism, as you know, right, even in our time. It has a big potential, and because of that hope, the Jewish people chug on. So here we are about to do Tisha B'Av. What is Tisha B'Av all about? It's mourning the past, but that only makes sense if you look forward to a restoration in the future. Right? Doesn't make any sense to worry about something that happened long ago if you haven't done something. That's why most Jews today have never heard of Tisha B'Av and aren't interested in it. because they're not interested in restoring a temple or something like that. That's from the old days. And therefore, Tisha B'Av is just not interesting to them. It's not relevant. It's only, you keep up the memory if you feel it has some kind of a relevance. If it's just from the past, it's kind of, I won't say boring, but it becomes the confines only of historical specialists, who, as we all know, are a weird lot. And so the result is that it goes away from the public consciousness. It's interesting in this regard. A very complex legacy of the Bar Kochva rebellion. So I come to the end. As I say, I purpose structured it so we finish the day before Tisha B'Av. Remember, Tisha B'Av commemorates a number of things. One of them is the fall of Beitar, which is the Mishnah's way of talking about the Bar Kochva rebellion. It was too painful of a subject to talk about the word Bar Kochva, which doesn't exist in the Jewish literature, as I told you before. They didn't want to mention this because it was just too painful of a, it's not something you want to bring up over there. I'll tell you a famous, funny story that they say. I wasn't there, but I think it was Reb Chaim Brisker, Reb Chaim Soloveitchik. It's a famous story. 100 and some years ago, I was on a train in Russia, and in front of him was this old Jew, a simple Jew, and two missionaries going to work on him. And they were arguing this, arguing that. And this guy was saying, don't forget me up, I don't know the answers to this. What about this text or what about that text? And he said basically something along the lines, look, I'm no great scholar, I don't claim to be, so you're wasting your time with somebody like me. I know we had our great sages, and if they felt, right, that Jesus was not the Messiah, so they probably knew what they're talking about. Whereupon the guy said like this, you see they make a mistake, what about Bar Kochva? Even you admit that. Good point, right? I said, Rabbi, keep a bet on the wrong horse, no question about that. So you see they could be wrong. And he was perplexed. So the story goes like this, whereupon Reb Chaim Brisker was sitting behind, and in Russia you had to watch what you say, you get in trouble with the police. So he said, he stuck his nose in and said like this, who says the Rabbi Kiva was wrong? How do you know Bar Kochva was not the Mashiach? Whereupon the missionary said like this, that's ridiculous. He said, why is it ridiculous? Maybe Bar Kochva really was the Mashiach. Of course he was not the Mashiach. How do you know he was not the Mashiach? He failed to rebuild the Jewish state. He failed to gather the Jews from all quarters of the earth, and the Romans killed him. He said, that's all I want to hear. So there's different ways of interpreting the Bar Kochva story, as you can see. I conclude, therefore, with the famous formulation of the Rambam, who insisted that this should be one of the Ikrim. Not everybody agreed with this, but the Rambam insists that the belief in the coming Mashiach is one of the Ikrim of Judaism, one of the basic principles of Judaism, which is very interesting. Meaning, if you have no hope for the future of this, then you're not going to be interested in Tisha B'Av. You're also not going to be interested in Shabbos. You're not going to be interested in anything if you follow it through to its logical conclusion. But it's very famous that the Rambam, of course, said, "Ani ma'amin b'emunah shlema b'yas HaMashiach, I'll be shi'itz mameh." But I don't get into details. This is the famous Maimonidean formulation, right? This is actually a vulgarization of what the Rambam really says. It's the Ani Mam is the back of the Siddur. If you read the actual essay, it's a lot more elaborate and a lot better, filled out. And there he says like this, he says, every Jew has to believe the Mashiach, don't go for the details because we don't know them. You understand? We might get it wrong, we might get it right. Bother in there, the Jewish people chug along century after century in spite of all the efforts of our enemies to crush us in, because we have a basic idea, the Mashiach is coming. He could come tomorrow. If it doesn't come tomorrow, come the next day. Is it going to be, black, blue, green, orange? Is it going to be a Judah Maccabee type of this type or that type or whatever? I don't know. I know it's going to happen. And when it happens, then we'll say afterwards, all the people tell you, I know it all the time. But, they don't know exactly. And as we stand, as I say before, just before Tisha B'Av, it is painful but appropriate to recall that Hadrian's decree still exists. Hadrian's decree is still in force today. The Jews are not allowed to build a temple in Temple Mount. Right? The Arabs simply picked up from the Romans when they captured Jerusalem in 640. They said, okay, it's not a church, it's a mosque now. But one thing they all have in common. The Jews ain't getting to build nothing up there. And I don't see anybody challenging that who's not looking for World War III. And so the Jews say, great, we got the Kotel, or at least we're fighting over that. But think about what I'm saying. The Jews say we have the right to stand in front of the outer wall. And even that they're fighting over. The Arabs won't agree with that. The outer wall. Nobody's saying, except a few radicals, let's go on the other side and rebuild the temple. It doesn't look like it's in the realm of reality. And that means that we're in the year 2013, which is what, from the year 135? Quite a long time. And Hadrian's rule is still there. So it behooves us to end this series with the famous words that we end, Hashem